Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Among the potential countries listed for a program to enhance US force posture and infrastructure in countering China is the tiny country of Timor-Leste. Located between Indonesia and Australia and just 680 kilometers north of Darwin, Timor-Leste is the youngest country in Asia. It has a population of just 1.34 million, covering an area less than half the size of Taiwan. Since Timor-Leste gained independence in 2002, both Australia and China have been actively positioning themselves for influence in the country. Can the country remain independent when it comes to great power politics, as its president says it will do? Or will it shift into either the US sphere of influence or that of China? And with a recent state visit by Timor-Leste President Ramos Horta to Beijing, what impact would a Chinese shift have on ASEAN, the South China Sea, or Taiwan? Joining us today are Wenchi Yu, Harvard Kennedy School Fellow and host of Taiwanplus's Zoom In, Zoom Out, and William Vocke, Western Pacific Fellowship Project Vice President, and Vincent Chao, Taipei City Councilor and former Taipei Economic and Cultural Representative, Washington Office Political Head. A very warm welcome to you all on the show today. Let me come to you first, Wenchi. Why was China was the first country to recognize Timor-Leste when it gained independence. Why do you think it was so keen to do that?
Well, I think, first of all, the current leader of Timor-Leste, Dr. Ramos Horta, personally has a relationship with China dated back to in the 70s, and he's personally visited China many times. And then second, Timor-Leste obviously consider one of the global south, and China has been reaching out to countries in the global south to establish those relationships with them. And third, Belt and Road Initiative, Timor-Leste is one of them. For countries that need a lot of economic assistance as well as development, China sort of serves as a good potential partner to them. And so, on all three levels, we've seen that China has played a role in Timor-Leste trade relationship as well as economic cooperation and security now, as you mentioned.
Okay, right. Timor-Leste occupies a location at the end point of the second island chain, an American Cold War era defense barrier that stretches through Japan, Guam, and down to Indonesia. In September 2023, Timor-Leste and China upgraded ties to the highest level of a comprehensive strategic partnership. The new partnership focuses largely on building food self-sufficiency and infrastructure in Timor-Leste, as well as trade ties, but there is a military component. And after the recent July 2024 meeting between Xi Jinping and Ramos Horta, their joint statement said both sides would, quote, closely interact at all levels in the military and police departments and strengthen cooperation in such areas as personnel training, equipment and technology, joint exercises and training, police and law enforcement, security. William, so why would you say that the US and Australia are very concerned about comparisons with the Solomon Islands?
Well, the Solomon Islands developed an economic relationship with China, and then that has moved on to talk about a fairly significant military relationship, particularly a deep water naval base. If you could just go back to World War II and look at the Pacific and the importance of island bases in the Pacific for control of that region, that's of significant concern to the United States, who has a position which suggests that it needs to protect parts of the Pacific as basically American waters.
Vincent, this idea of the strategic location of Timor-Leste. Can you tell us a little bit more about this? Is this related to a possible Taiwan contingency?
Well, it's a bit far for Taiwan contingency, to be honest, but certainly Timor-Leste has quite a significant strategic presence for two reasons. I mean, first one, just their strategic distance from Canberra. I mean, this is what is making Australians, I think, quite nervous about this relationship that Timor-Leste is building with China. I mean, we had talked about the thinking of what happened in the Solomon Islands, and certainly Honiara's willingness to entertain Beijing's ideas about building a naval base in the region. And we know that.
So what's that naval base for? What's the purpose of China having a naval base there?
So when the Solomon Islands had diplomatic relations with Taiwan, one of the arguments that we've made for a long time was that we are able to keep Beijing from gaining a foothold in that region, particularly given, again, the distance between the Solomon Islands and Australia. Of course, when Honiara then chose to break diplomatic relations, they cited economic and other reasons for doing so. I mean, they said they were very careful in saying that this will not lead to a security relationship. Now, that was broken immediately afterwards, where I think the New York Times had a scoop saying that Beijing was in discussions to build a deep water port, naval port, that would allow Chinese basing close to Australia, which would have, I think, make people remember sort of the bases in Guadalcanal in the Second World War. And so I think that repeat is what Australia is seeking to avoid with Timor-Leste. I mean, Timor-Leste, to be honest, it's an underdeveloped country. I mean, its GDP is small, its population is small, but it does occupy a very strategic place in the region. So that's the first part. But the second part is this, is that Timor-Leste has actually, interestingly enough, chosen to pursue membership in ASEAN instead of the Pacific Island Forum, which many had initially expected. I mean, I think culturally, linguistically, and ethnically, I think people had expected that they would choose to participate in PIF. However, I think because of their relationship with Indonesia, they instead decided that they would pursue ASEAN membership. Now, they haven't been granted membership yet, but certainly ASEAN is a very important strategic bloc in the region, not only for reasons of the South China Sea, which China is currently very much invested in, but also in terms of their relationship with the United States and other important strategic partners. So I think China sees Timor-Leste as a potential third friendly voice in ASEAN, aside from Laos and Cambodia. And if Timor-Leste is able to gain that membership, then I think they would be able to, if, for example, they so choose so, to support Chinese initiatives, whether in the South China Sea or elsewhere, that would be potentially to the detriment of democracies such as Australia, but also other claimants in the ASEAN bloc itself.
William.
I do want to come back to another point, if I might. I think we're in danger here of overlooking the perspective of the Timorese. We're talking about it from kind of a great power perspective. And from the perspective of the Timorese, they don't have a whole lot of options. As Vincent has said, it's a very poor country. They have gas and oil in fields. One is developed but fading. The other is undeveloped at this point. They don't have a lot of other resources. They have to import their food. Not all their food, of course, but some of their food. And the country itself needs investment and needs engagement. China is 25% about of their exports and imports. So it's a major economic player for Timorese. I want to take exception with the idea that Ramos Horta, for instance, is particularly friendly to China. He has visited China many times. He's also visited many other places. I had the opportunity back in the 1990s to work with him and several other Nobel Peace Laureates on a project in Cincinnati, Ohio, Washington, D.C., and Portugal. And his primary concern then, he's always been a centrist, his primary concern then was the well-being of the people of East Timor. And I suspect that's what's driving, from a Timorese perspective, that's what's driving the relationship with China. This is a place where they may be able to get resources, investment, exports, etc. I think that perspective is very different than the kind of the great power perspective looking at East Timor. And there are quid pro quos. If you want investment, you also have to do something in return. I would point out that in terms of the military relationship, my last figures on the Timorese army was about 2,000, 2,500 people, and their navy was less than 1,000 people and 2 boats, 2 patrol craft. That does not constitute any kind of threat. What constitutes a threat is the fact that China might develop a very strong strategic military relationship and a naval base there.
So is it more about encircling Australia?
I completely agree with the idea that there are 2 completely different perspectives in how we should look at Timor-Leste. There's the perspective that we have here in Taiwan and that folks would perhaps have in Canberra, in terms of great power competition, in terms of potentially opening a backdoor for Chinese influence, in terms of the Chinese expanding their military presence there. But we have to keep in mind that this is a country of just over 1 million people with a very low GDP. Only 5% have any sort of university education. 35% of adults are working. They have a trade deficit about 80%. They're 80% of their government revenues are dependent on oil. I mean, this is a country without a lot of options, and China is providing that option. I mean, we saw during this recent state visit when Ramos Horta said that, hey, if China can help us develop, if China can help us eradicate extreme hunger, if China can help us build these basic infrastructure, I mean, China will be a hero to the people of the Timor-Leste.
We can also look at it at different levels, yeah? So we can look at it at the Timorese level, and right now what I'm asking is, why would China want to build a naval base or a military base there? And you're telling me it's not to do with the Taiwan contingency. So then my next question is maybe to Wenchi, is it about encircling Australia?
I'm not so sure if it's really targeting Australia per se, but you can use the same argument to say, why does the U.S. want AUKUS, right? Or want Australia to be part of the Pacific Island chain because it's so far away from Taiwan? I mean, you can look at it in different ways. I do think just like China's, expanding its naval influence, why does it need to access Cambodia's Ream naval base?
Why does it need to have Solomon Islands?
Right. I mean, in some way, it is expanding your presence, even if you are not basing your military there yet. We see that, for any powerful country with powerful military in the world, I mean, they would always need to have access to other countries, and via those access points where, they can maybe have their military soldiers, be based there. They're all, varying degrees of presence, right? So having that presence in some way does help China, again, expand its military influence.
And so, William, we know that according to Beijing, at least 2 Chinese naval visits have occurred, not just to Timor-Leste, but in the same journeys also to Cambodia. This is from early May to mid-June of this year, so quite recent. And the ministry said the visits were, and this is interesting, training and joint exercises to allow the 2 navies to, I quote, contribute to building a maritime community with a shared future. What do you think that means?
It means in very simple terms that the Chinese are interested in expanding their military capacities in the region. And they've found someone who is willing to provide them with a rationale for their ships to visit. And I think it's probably significant that it was Cambodia that was the other piece of the visit. As Vincent has said, Cambodia is probably the most pro-China piece of ASEAN. And in ASEAN, votes are decided by a simple majority. There's a veto power on the part of any member. So one vote is very important. But the military piece is, you have to think about this in terms of kind of traditional great power politics. In traditional great power politics, there's almost a zero-sum assumption of where power exists and where it doesn't exist, and where there are weaknesses or where there are openings. And this would be a place where there seems to be an opening for China, and China is filling that. Australia has the capacity to fill it, but Australia has a more varied relationship with East Timor. And the United States is not interested in getting involved instead of Australia. It's interested in letting Australia play the lead role here.
Okay. Vincent, so Ramos, talking about what you were saying about, I think both you and William were talking about, what the Timorese want. They want development, they want economic growth, and that maybe there is something that they need to give in return. So Ramos Horta, in a recent CNBC interview, he criticized the United States for arming Taiwan. He basically called it detrimental. He said that Taiwan is a part of China, and that he went even further. He said no amount of arms would save Taiwan if China was to invade. It's interesting because, of course, Timor-Leste itself, as we talked about, gained independence in 2008. 2002. That was quite a bloody struggle, a long, long struggle for Timor-Leste. For you, are there any parallels or differences with Taiwan's situation?
Well, I think the differences outweigh the parallels, but let me just go back and say this. I think what Beijing and what Timor-Leste wants out of the relationship are far different things. And so we talked about what Timor-Leste wants, obviously, which is development, which is economic growth, which is tourism. China obviously wants something that's completely different in terms of strategic, military, and political clout, and that includes statements like what we heard on the China issue. And perhaps Timor-Leste feels that that's a small price to pay for what China is putting into the economy, and saying that, for example, that they have a Taiwan one China principle, whereas most countries say policy, I think would be, in their view, maybe a small price to pay. But I do think that there are some similarities in the sense that the Timorese have wanted independence for quite some time. I mean, they were colonized essentially by the Portuguese in the 17th and 18th century. They had a tortured past. You know, the Portuguese government essentially abandoned them, both prior to and following the Second World War. I mean, in 1974, essentially, the Timorese were left to fight a civil war amongst themselves with almost little to no foreign intervention. The Indonesian government invaded them following that because of fears of communism. And then they suffered, I think, under Indonesian occupation for decades as well, until finally, like you said, reaching their independence in 2002. So I think the will to establish something that's there is certainly there in Timor-Leste, and certainly here in Taiwan, we also have our struggles with colonialism, with occupation, and so forth. But I do think that the differences ultimately outweigh the similarities in a sense that the Timorese independence struggle was ultimately, I think, an international agreement that was brokered with the Indonesian government and with other stakeholders as well, whereas in Taiwan, we're very much dominated by this one issue, which is China.
William, are there lessons there for either China or Taiwan in the example of Timor-Leste, which, you know, Vincent has said that there's more differences than parallels?
Lessons in what sense?
Lessons, well, for example, Vincent pointed out that it was an international consensus, I guess, that, you know, that the annexation was illegal. And this is what carried through the momentum for independence. So,
there really are not lessons. Unfortunately, the struggle in Timor-Leste from 1975 until the late 1990s was a guerrilla struggle. It was an ongoing battle inside the country against Indonesian troops. And Indonesian troops and Indonesian administrators were pretty brutal in trying to put that down. And Indonesia finally gave up. Indonesia finally said, this is costing too many resources, too many people, it's not worth it. And then that deal was brokered internationally through the United Nations, and the United Nations peacekeeping force went in. And subsequently, Australian and United Nations troops have gone in again because of domestic violence, domestic political strife brought about by the 2006-2008 financial crisis and the bottom dropping out of the East Timor economy.
Now, turning to Australia, Canberra has been accused of neglecting Timor-Leste, a similar argument for Canberra's relations with Pacific Islands. Negotiations have also been stalled for a long time over Timor-Leste's Greater Sunrise gas field and the ambitious Taze-Mane project. The disagreement focuses on Timor-Leste wanting Australian energy giant Woodside to pipe gas to Timor-Leste for processing rather than to Darwin. An announcement is expected soon. Back in September 2022, Australian Foreign Minister Penny Wong said in Dili, "We know that economic resilience can be affected, can be constrained by unsustainable debt burdens or lenders who have different objectives." After Dili said it may turn to China. Wenchi, let me come to you. So why do you think that Australia, still to this day, that they haven't clinched the deal on this gas field?
Well, I don't really know the details of this deal, but I think, again, coming back to sort of this global south, post-independent mentality of many of those countries and many in the Pacific island sort of region. Australia is a funny country to them because Australia is this like giant rich country in their neighborhood that's historically provided most economic development assistance to their countries. And I've personally visited, for example, Cook Islands as well as Papua New Guinea, right? So for those countries, despite decades of receiving Australian development assistance, they do hold grudges and feel resentment towards Australia in the sense that they feel it's another colonial country treating them like they're secondary citizens, right? So I think that mentality is translated into many other things in terms of that relationship, even, attitude towards just the West in general. And now you have an alternative that is China coming in, providing something that is similar but doesn't have the historic baggage in the sense that demanding human rights, values, etc. So it's easy to say I have an alternative. What is interesting is to say, 1 decade, 2 decades from now on, do they feel that again?
William, and that relationship between Timor-Leste and Australia is very complex. I mean, Australia is the main security provider for Timor-Leste, and that's why it's interesting that China's strategic partnership now does include, as we understand, the security element. There's also, as we mentioned at the top of the show, the fact that it is on the list for possible inclusion in the Pacific Deterrence Initiative. This is where the Pentagon has said that the U.S. Marine Rotational Force may or not be accommodated at these different sites operating. That Marine force operates out of Darwin for 6 months of the year. So, just looking at the position of Timor-Leste, it does seem to be in the crosshairs of China on one side, and then there's Australia, or Australia stroke the US on the other side. How difficult do you think it is for a country to remain independent of these sort of great power rivalries?
It is difficult. You're correct. I mean, often sides want to force a choice. A couple of interesting additional facts about Timor-Leste. One is that it is a democracy, and it's a democracy that has had relatively peaceful transition of power on a number of times. The parliament, for instance, is made up of a number of parties, and those parties are involved in a coalition government. The president, Ramos Horta, is elected independently from that. Another interesting fact about East Timor is they use the US dollar as their currency, which suggests some relationship to the United States and some concern for the United States. I think from a Timor-Leste perspective, they are trying to walk a line. And whether they're successful at walking that line as great power competition gets more and more serious, will be difficult. But that's a line they are trying to walk, and I think they've done it fairly well so far. It takes financial aid from the United States through AID and aid from Australia as well.
Vincent, what's your view on currently how independent Timor-Leste is? I want to just quote from a joint statement after the two sides upgraded in 2023 to the highest level of partnership. This joint statement said that it was a sign of increased cooperation and mutual political solidarity. And in a speech to the UN, the President, Ramos Horta, said that talk of China being a menace or a threat was unjustified and unfair. And he basically said that China, is an engine for growth and stability, essentially, in the region.
Yeah, well, let me go back to the gas field just quickly and say, I think Australia holds a lot of cards in that respect. I mean, it's a cross-border gas field. The Sunrise project we're talking about, Australia controls 80% of the deposits, Timor about 20%. And so the Australians, I think, have treated this in years past as more of a commercial case. I think the Timorese have treated this quite politically, arguing that with their 20% that they should hold more of the revenue, do more of the profit sharing and so forth. So I think it's a difficult case, but it's one I think the two have to work together on, essentially. There's no other choice. Now, that brings me to what I'm trying to say, which is I think the Timorese would do what they feel is in their best interest. And their best interest at this point is to have development and to have investment. And if that comes from China, then so be it. And if that comes with a price from China, namely acknowledging and agreeing to a one China principle, having this highest level of strategic comprehensive agreement with the Chinese, it calls for a state visit, the first ever, to Beijing, then maybe they feel that's a necessary price to pay. And certainly maybe they feel that's a small price to pay in a country with fairly limited options at this point. So I do think it's like this. Countries, including Australia, but also Taiwan and also the United States, need to think long, deep, and hard about how we can make our own propositions much more attractive to these countries. And I think we have the capacity to do so, particularly working together, which is something that an advantage that the Chinese won't be able to bear. And so we need to think about having that proposition instead of talking to them and saying that, hey, in great power competition, you don't want to stand on the wrong side of history. You don't want to do this because they're communists. I think ultimately that's going to fall on deaf ears. And certainly that's my experience as well, having negotiated and discussed many things with our diplomatic allies in the Pacific, which is ultimately they want development, they want investment, and they're going to go with the country that is best able to provide that.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there.
There's an important term here that hasn't been mentioned, hedging. And that's exactly what the East Timors are doing. They're hedging their bets, from trying to play both sides. It's an interesting observation to watch a country try to do that.
Okay, we'll have to end it there. Thank you so much, Wenchi Yu, William Vocke, and Vincent Chao for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe, and see you next time.